peace in Libya? October 20th marks the 5th anniversary of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi's death. In 2011, Gaddafi was killed by opposition forces in Sirte, the very city in which he was born. His death was supposed to liberate the Libyan people and save them from genocide. But today, the country's government is still divided and terrorist factions have taken over. We now examine what went wrong that led to Gaddafi's death in Libya, what really drove the international community to intervene, and whether the country is better off without its controversial leader. RT's William Whiteman recently returned from Sirte, where he witnessed firsthand what daily life is like in Libya today.
We are making our way through the front lines in Sirte. At an intersection, a Libyan government fighter warns us to drive as fast as possible. Islamic State sharpshooters are firing on anything crossing the road. Suddenly, these fighters spot an Islamic State suicide car bomb being driven straight at our position. As we rushed inside to take cover, a Libyan fighter shot the incoming armored car with an RPG, killing the driver and stopping the vehicle in its tracks.
It looks like the big explosion. We don't know what happened, but these guys are all firing off around this corner here. It's really kicking off here. This is the car bomb. Yeah, there was a car bomb just outside. They were just looking. Sweet. Just a mortar round, just hitting the end. Outside now. It was really intense, but this is just the start of it. They need to advance from here as well. This is just a warm-up, essentially. Can you see it at all in there?
A booby trap, left behind by retreating Islamic State fighters. Anyone naive enough to have lifted the blanket off this mannequin would have detonated the explosive device hidden beneath it. But while this trap was obvious, Islamic State bomb makers are often highly skilled at finding inventive ways to kill and maim, as we soon found out.
It's exploded.
Just drove over there.
While driving through territory newly retaken from the terrorist group, we came across an unexploded mortar round in the road. We decided we needed to do something to alert other drivers to it.
We're gonna put some stuff in the street because we didn't see that. Anyone could drive over that, so we're just gonna try and mark it out.
In doing so, we almost fell for an Islamic State bomb maker's trap.
Come and see this. Here.
Oh,
whoa! There's
a booby trap right here. There's a booby trap right behind this. Can you see that the wire's coming out the back there?
Knowing that the advancing Libyans would want to mark the unexploded projectile out in the road, Islamic State rigged this nearby traffic cone with a bomb. We immediately radioed for a sapper unit to come and help deal with the trap. In the latest advance alone, a Libyan battalion discovered 5 Islamic State bomb factories. We went to meet with the battalion to take a closer look at what we were up against. As we drove to their frontline position, we passed a burning building that had recently been struck by an Islamic State mortar.
Islamic State, Daesh, have taken this out and they attach it to a bomb, twist this round here, and leave it, and it basically, time said, you can hear it here. You can hear it clicking down. It then goes off. So they'll just leave it in a car or somewhere, wait for the Libyan government forces to advance past them, boom, it goes off. Kills a lot of people. I mean, this is very simple technology, but it's very, very effective. This is why Islamic State is so difficult to push out. They're being very inventive with their bombs.
From Sirte, William Whiteman, RT.
Whiteman, who you just saw there, is one of few journalists who has reported from the ground in Libya. Chaos and the need for increased security make it extremely hard for reporters to enter the country. Those who do manage to get in face imminent danger. Human Rights Watch counted at least 91 attacks and threats against journalists in Libya between 2012 and 2014. These include at least 30 kidnappings and 8 killings. As a result, the mainstream media has failed to report reliably about what goes on inside. RT's Lizzie Phelan was in Tripoli during the uprising in 2011. What she saw often conflicted with the narrative sold by the mainstream media. She joins me now to discuss the media's role in the downfall of Gadaffi. Lizzie, thank you so much for being with me today. How different was the news coverage of the events in Libya in the wake of the uprising from what you actually saw on the ground?
The initial claims that were made by the British, American, and French governments, as well as a host of their allies, to justify the bombing of Libya was, of course, that the Libyan government, led by the former leader Muammar Gadaffi, was about to commit a massacre against its own people, against his own people. And there were words like genocide and bloodbath that were thrown about. And this claim was made to justify enforcing a so-called no-fly zone and intervention in Libya. We were told that this was being done to protect Libyan civilians. But of course, very quickly, it became clear that the real goal of the intervention was the destruction of the Libyan army, the Libyan state, and ultimately the leader, Muammar Gadaffi, all goals which were illegal under international law, but nevertheless NATO succeeded in fulfilling. Now, on the ground, as you mentioned, I was in the capital, Tripoli, which at the time was under the control of the Libyan government led by Muammar Gadaffi. And it was very difficult for me to find these people that we were being told in our media were everywhere, that viewed Muammar Gadaffi as an absolute monster that they were terrified of. In fact, on the contrary, while I met many people who were, of course, critical of their government, by and large, most of the people I met were relatively content with the lives that they were living in Libya. BBC, for one, reported quite unquestioningly that witnesses saw Libyan government airplanes strafing peaceful protesters with bullets. This was reported almost without question. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also repeated this claim in a statement. And a few weeks later, when the United States Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and other American military officials were asked if these claims were true, they said that, in fact, there was no evidence that those claims were true.
So 5 years later, as you were mentioning there, all of the media from those Western nations that are involved in this coalition were originally saying that it was about one thing. Now, UK Parliament has recently released a report stating that exactly what you say, based on what you actually saw on the ground, that it's all lies. Do you think anybody is going to now be held accountable? And are you surprised to see this report 5 years later?
It's quite surreal to see that report because, as you said, at the time, you know, there was very clear evidence, like to look at some of the key elements of the report, which was that, you know, as I mentioned, there wasn't really any credible evidence that there was a threat of a massacre being carried out against Libyan civilians. That was confirmed by this report. Also the fact that the threat of Islamist extremists that had a heavy presence in this so-called peaceful uprising was ignored. You know, the Libyan government at the time was repeatedly warning about this threat of extremists like Al-Qaeda, but they were dismissed as crazy. Anybody else who repeated that claim was simply dismissed as a supporter of the Libyan government. This, again, confirmed by this British Parliament report. The role of the media, you know, as basically spreading lies, also confirmed by this report. So I'm not sure if it's a surprise, but it was quite surreal to read this come from a British Parliament report. Who's responsible? Of course, all of the Western governments who told these lies to the publics, to the United Nations, to justify the destruction of another country are responsible. Will anybody be held accountable? Well, that's really up to people, you know, to be informed about the extent to which they've been lied to and to demand that those who lied to them are held responsible to make sure that they are. I'm not really sure that we're yet at that stage, unfortunately.
Right. RT correspondent Lizzie Phelan, thank you so much. While many people in Libya opposed Colonel Gadaffi, there were others who supported him. I recently spoke with Professor of International Law, Francis A. Boyle, who previously spent time in Libya. Here's what he had to say about Gadaffi.
The Libyans had an incredibly high standard of living, the highest in Africa. When I first went to Libya in 1986, I was amazed by the empowerment of women. Now, women hold up half the sky. And what I saw in Libya was that women could do anything they wanted to do. And some of the old men and the religious figures don't like it, but there's not much they can do about it. So, yeah, it's a very tough area of the world. I'm not here to justify any human rights violations that might have been committed by Colonel Gadaffi. But given the situation in Libya, you know, he did the best he could, I think.
But many who lived under Gaddafi's rule have a different story. I sat down with filmmaker Hamouda Abidia, who rebelled against Gaddafi in Benghazi during the uprising.
Personally, okay, I was against Gaddafi, okay, right? And when I came here to the state, he imprisoned and killed some of my friends. And their crime, okay, that they were trying to establish student union. But the big story is, you know, he killed 1,270 prisoners inside the prison because they were, protesting the bad conditions. Some of the prisoners, they were sick because of bad ventilation and bad, you know, food.
How did the Libyan people react to the NATO campaign in 2011?
During the revolution, and I was there, I participated in it, okay? The American flag, people are carrying it in the street, okay? When Clinton went there, and even when McCain went there, people were degrading them, okay? They think of it that these are gonna save us, okay? And sadly, they just did nothing. And then not just did nothing, okay? They really encouraged this Islamist. And the State Department, the CIA, and the Congress and stuff, they are not stupid.
The international community had a love-hate relationship with Gaddafi. In 2003, his strained relationship with the United States began to improve. He had recently given up his biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, clearing his country from the State Department's axis of evil. Sanctions against Libya were then lifted, and diplomatic ties with Gaddafi were restored. Condoleezza Rice made a historic journey to Tripoli in 2008 to welcome him back into the international community. It was the first time a sitting Secretary of State had been in the country in 50 years. And it was no secret that the colonel had an infatuation with her. Their meeting was so odd that she later wrote about it in her biography. Apparently, he'd arranged a private dinner for them in his kitchen. At the end of dinner, she wrote, Gaddafi told me that he'd made a videotape for me. Uh-oh, I thought, what's this gonna be? It was an innocent collection of photos of me with world leaders, President Bush, Vladimir Putin, Hu Jintao, and so on, set to the music of a song called Black Flower in the White House, written for me by a Libyan composer. It was weird. Gaddafi was feeling the love for Condoleezza, and America's reunion with Libya was also about love, the love of oil.
As you know, the Bush family has very extensive ties with the oil business, petroleum business, and they wanted good relations with Gaddafi to make money.
In 2009, Gaddafi praised President Barack Obama, calling him a friend and blessing to the Muslim world. At the time, business between the two countries seemed promising. In April that year, Gaddafi's son even visited Washington.
I am very pleased to welcome Minister Gaddafi here to the State Department. We deeply value the relationship between the United States and Libya. We have
2 years later, here he is again, just a few moments before being executed by rebels. His support for PLO and 2 terrorist attacks had previously made Gaddafi an enemy. The first took place at a nightclub in Berlin, and the second over Lockerbie, Scotland, with the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The attack left 270 dead. Gaddafi later accepted responsibility for the attack, even though the prosecutor in the case said there was no evidence proving Gaddafi had made the order. In 2011, European relations with Gaddafi suddenly turned sour. Over 3 decades, Gaddafi had gone from mad dog of the Middle East to Western ally and back. Sarkozy then turned on Gaddafi, selling weapons to Libyan rebels while still making a profit. By March, France and Britain were leading a military campaign against him, a campaign that NATO would soon officially join. So what went wrong? Why did Europe turn on its former friend? RT's Peter Oliver investigates.
Here in Germany back in 2011, the powers that be weren't convinced that military action against Libya was the way forward. Their EU partners, though, were more than willing. And with Gaddafi ousted from power, it was time for those that did the ousting to enjoy their moment. But leaked emails between then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and a senior advisor about the French Foreign Intelligence Service, the DGSE, indicate that very good day was actually more to do with French oil company interests.
It's certainly suspicious, and it would be by no means the first time that France allowed commercial interests to dictate its conduct, which has often been very mercenary.
It was a move that represented an extreme about-turn from Sarkozy. Like many other European leaders, the French president had cozied up to Gaddafi in the years before the bombing campaign, with some reports claiming that Gaddafi donated tens of millions of euro to Sarkozy's presidential campaign in 2007. Those close to the French government say it was the influence of Washington that changed the relationship.
President Sarkozy tried to make agreements with Gaddafi just after being elected in Paris. Then he decided to change his policy, but I think also that the pressures from Washington helped him to change his policy.
That change in policy has left Libya a cauldron of extremism and uncertainty, and given a twisted resonance to the words of the NATO Secretary General at the time.
Now is the time to create a new Libya.
As well as left lessons of past mistakes unlearned.
I think they haven't learned because they don't want to learn. One could come to the conclusion that they are profiting from the war and from the turmoil.
In the 5 years since they arrived in Libya as conquering heroes, both Cameron and Sarkozy have left office. But with the Frenchmen staging a comeback campaign for the Élysée Palace, there are still huge questions over Sarkozy's motivation for overthrowing Gaddafi 5 years ago.
Vive Benghazi! Vive la Libye! Vive l'amitié entre la France et la Libye!
Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
That same March, the UN Security Council authorized military action, including airstrikes against Libyan government forces and a no-fly zone. After all, in the words of Winston Churchill, the power of an air force is terrific when there's nothing to oppose it. Virginia State Senator Richard Black offers his take on the intervention, which he says is more about accomplishing a different geopolitical goal.
The United States got involved in Libya because we had intended to take down Syria. They knew it would take a tremendous military force to bring down Syria, and so they invaded Libya for the purpose of capturing their very large store of weapons. Colonel Gadaffi had acquired an enormous store to defend Libya against attack. So he had tanks, he had anti-tank missiles, he had anti-aircraft missiles, he had heavy cannon and so forth. Since 2011, we have been supplying the terrorists in Syria with those weapons.
5 years ago, Gaddafi was brutally murdered at the hands of rebels in his hometown of Sirte. Coalition leaders responded with hope for Libya's future, and one person with manic enthusiasm.
We came, we saw, he died.
People in Libya today have an even greater chance after this news of building themselves a strong and democratic future. I'm proud of the role that Britain has played in helping them to bring that about.
This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya.
Today, Gaddafi is dead, but the throne is still up for grabs. The UN-backed Government of National Accord has failed to establish itself as the country's dominant government. Rival governments and terrorist groups now fight for solid ground. Former senior policy analyst Michael Malouf is here to talk about the prospects of the country and why Libya has become a terrorist haven. Mr. Malouf, thank you so much for being with me here today.
My pleasure.
Okay, so let's talk about the competing governments in Libya. How does their failure to unite contribute to the spread of terrorism?
Well, it's creating a vacuum, a political vacuum, and you're on the verge of a civil war between Benghazi and Tripoli. Those are the two strong points where you have governments that are competing with one another for legitimacy. Right now, the UN, as you point out, recognizes the government in Tripoli. But you have the Libyan army in Benghazi, which is seeking to ultimately overthrow that government, and it's creating greater tensions. In fact, within the Government of National Accord, there's also disunity because the head of the Libyan army, General Hifter, sees the government as basically supporting the militants. He is backed by the Egyptians, which makes it interesting with more outside influence coming into this, as well as on the Tripoli side, you have the West, which is supporting that government.
What do you anticipate will happen from here? Do you think that Haftar will be able to get an edge over the UN-backed government, and who will ultimately control Libya?
Well, the hope is that there will be some accommodation. However, he seems to be very determined to take over. He seems to, he feels that it doesn't represent the people of Libya. And as a consequence, I think we could easily embroil into a civil war. And what's adding to this is that the Government of National Accord is so unstable anyway. They have infighting to the point where they're fighting among themselves internally. And so that adds another ingredient to the instability that he can actually take advantage of. And in the meantime, they're trying to get rid of ISIS in Sirte, which is in between the two locations when you look at a map. And of course, the Government of National Accord is against ISIS, as is General Haftar. ISIS can go in a number of directions. ISIS can just dissipate out of Sirte. They can go into the south of the country. It can go into neighboring Algeria and Tunisia, which is also beginning to experience increasing instability. And it can go south where it's open area, and that'll give them more of an opportunity to consolidate their forces. There is some concern that ISIS could use Libya as a springboard to go into Europe.
And we've seen attacks in Paris and in Nice. And what about the French in this? What role do they play? They are sort of, it seems to be playing a double game here.
Yeah, they are. They do officially support the Government of National Accord in Tripoli. On the other hand, they are working counterterrorism activities with General Haftar. So they're playing both ends against the middle. They have economic interests, namely the oil. And Benghazi, which General Haftar controls the oil. That is the flow of money for all of Libya. And the concern is that by him having that control, he has the economic stranglehold on the country right now.
Thank you so much, Michael Malouf, former senior policy analyst with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thanks.
Thank you.
5 years ago, NATO used its responsibility to protect doctrine as grounds to intervene. But the ensuing chaos that continues to this day leaves the very people NATO promised to protect no safer. The number of casualties in Libya were never actually accounted for. Estimates say up to 50,000 civilians died as a result of the war, and hundreds of thousands more have been displaced. Here's what Obama said was the biggest mistake of his presidency.
Failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
Jim Jatras, former U.S. diplomat, joins me now to discuss the hypocrisy of the R2P. Jim Jatras, Thank you so much for being with me today. I'd like to talk about the responsibility to protect and its key feature, the no-fly zone.
Well, one thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about Libya and the responsibility to protect, this is a movie we saw before Libya. It's a movie we've seen again since Libya, where you have the mainstream media working closely with the government to hype some kind of a humanitarian disaster, which is then used as a pretext to overlook legal niceties like the UN Charter and state sovereignty to say, but we must intervene because look at this suffering. And whether it was incubator babies in Kuwait, or whether it was Srebrenica or Raqqa in the Balkans, or now we see it with Aleppo and Aleppo boy in Syria, what we see is this kind of atrocity porn that the governments and the basically subservient media in the West like to use. I've recently written a study on this, how U.S. media serves as a transmission belt for wars of choice, and this unfortunately has become a well-polished standard methodology.
So the no-fly zone, expanded to a full-blown effort for regime change. Has regime change ever been successful in the past?
Probably not since Berlin in 1945. If we look at the regime changes that existed during the post-Cold War period, and you're right, the no-fly zone and the humanitarian protection of Benghazi was used as an excuse then by NATO to come over and overthrow Gadaffi and have regime change in Libya, as they're now trying to do in Syria. No, it hasn't been a success. At best, what you get is chaos. At worst, what you get is the terrorist groups, and these are radical Islamic jihadist terrorist groups that we have supported in Libya, we're now supporting in Syria, that conceivably could come to power.
So these humanitarian efforts to protect people with the no-fly zone end up ultimately killing more people. Why is it that nobody seems to be discussing how the R2P isn't actually protecting people?
Partly is because of the skewed media we get, skewed information we get from mainstream media, which so much of it simply derives from government sources. They simply report what they're given. And pardon my cynicism, I don't think protecting these people really is what is at stake. They will use this as a political pretext to accomplish a goal like regime change. Are they really trying to save lives? Are they really trying to make Americans safer? I don't think so, and I think they know that when they do these things. No.
All right, former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatros, thank you very much for being here today. Obama admits Libya was a mistake, and UK Parliament recently found that the entire intervention was based on lies. According to the report, Gaddafi had not been planning to massacre civilians as claimed, and the existing threat of extremism at the time was ignored. Despite these details, no Western leaders have yet to face any consequences. No one is being held accountable, because at the end of the day, at that moment in history, for the West, Gaddafi was a ruthless dictator who had to go.
Obviously, the United States didn't care when they dealt with him, just as with so many others that we deal with. So yes, he was probably rather ruthless, but he might have been as ruthless as the Shah, you know, that we supported for a long period of time. So often we say, you have to have an election like we do, and then they go ahead and have an election, but if they don't elect the guy we want, they can be in trouble. They may not last very long. Just look at what happened in Egypt.
Gaddafi was once an ally to the United States, despite the fact that, according to the coalition, he carried out gross violations of human rights, violations considered criminal in the civilized world. Today, the same can be said about other allies of the United States, but in the political game, perception is everything, and the rules are subjective. A ruthless leader today can be an important business partner tomorrow, and vice versa. A friend can be labeled a dictator who must be defeated. As history has proven, the fall of a dictator does not result in law and order. And with history repeating itself over and over again, maybe it's time for our leaders to realize that where nature makes allies of us all, we can demonstrate that beneficial relations are possible, even with those we most deeply disagree with. This must someday be the basis of world peace and world law. President Kennedy said these words during the first State of the Union address more than half a century ago. 50 years later, his words have yet to be heard.
Colonel Gadaffi
Libya must be protected.
Anti-Gaddafi fighters have taken
With the development, the news of Gaddafi being killed, does this mean